The battlefield never forgets. Beneath the quiet hills and fields where sheep now graze, history once shook the earth with gunfire, steel, and blood. Thousands screamed, fought, and died, but some say the war never truly ended. Witnesses across centuries report the same chilling phenomenon. Cannons booming in an empty sky, drums pounding from nowhere, ghostly voices crying out for help. Imagine standing alone on that ground when suddenly the air splits with the chaos of battle. Do you run? Do you stay? Or do you realize too late that you are hearing the past replay itself, echoing through time? These are not just stories whispered around campfires. They are accounts written by kings, soldiers, and everyday people. Tonight we step into the fog of war where history bleeds into the present and death itself seems unwilling to be silenced. History often records battles as events with a beginning and an end. Armies clash, men fall, treaties are signed, and life moves forward. Yet there are places where time seems unwilling to obey that order, where echoes of violence linger long after the last musket was fired. Historians sometimes call this phenomenon death's echo. Soldiers describe it as if the land itself absorbs the terror of battle, the cries of the wounded, the thunder of cannon, the shattering of steel, and then releases it again like a memory too painful to fade. Across Europe, America, and Asia, countless witnesses have claimed to hear phantom drums or see spectral ranks of soldiers marching through the mist. To skeptics, these are illusions, tricks of light and sound, but to others, they are reminders that war leaves more than graves behind. It leaves scars carved into the very soil, as if the battlefield itself became a witness that refuses to remain silent. Tonight, as we journey through these haunted landscapes, we will ask a troubling question. Are these, echoes simply folklore? Or is history still fighting to be heard? Edge Hill, 1642. The English Civil War began, as many wars do not, with a clear plan, but with simmering resentment that could no longer be contained. By the winter of 1642, England itself was divided. Neighbors turned against neighbors, towns split in loyalty, and families torn apart over allegiance to King Charles I, or to Parliament. The king, stubborn in his belief that divine right gave him unquestionable authority, marched at the head of his royalist supporters. Parliament, determined to check his power, rallied its own force. And so, by sheer chance, the two armies collided at a quiet place in Warwickshire, known simply as Edge Hill. At first glance, the sight was unremarkable: gentle green slopes, fields dotted with sheep, rolling countryside under the October sky. But on October 23rd, that peaceful hill erupted into a frenzy of violence. Over 30,000 men, many barely trained, many no older than 18, charged at one another with muskets, pikes, and sabers. The age of gunpowder had already dawned, yet the battle resembled something medieval: hand-to-hand carnage, men grappling with daggers when powder ran out, rocks and fists used when swords shattered. From sunrise to sunset, the air shook with gunfire, steel, and the cries of the dying. By nightfall, 4,000 lay dead or wounded. Neither side could claim victory. When dawn broke the next morning, both armies prepared to resume the slaughter. But then, inexplicably, neither advanced. Instead, the men wandered the battlefield in a daze, collecting the wounded, staring at the heaps of corpses. The war would continue for years, but Edge Hill would forever stand as its brutal overture. And yet some say the bloodshed never ended. Just 3 months later, local shepherds tending their flocks on the very same fields reported something that should have been impossible. Under the cold January stars, they suddenly heard the pounding of drums, the blare of horns, the clash of steel. Gunfire echoed across the valley where no soldiers stood. Startled, the men looked skyward, and there in the clouds, they swore they saw it: two ghostly armies clashing in the heavens, royalist banners, Parliament's colors, musket volleys bursting into smoke, horses screaming, men dying again just as they had on that October day. The shepherds fled in terror, but their story spread quickly. Local officials dismissed them as drunk or superstitious peasants until the phenomenon repeated. This time, the town's justice of the peace and several clergymen accompanied the shepherds to Edge Hill, and to their horror, they, too, witnessed it. The ghostly battle raged on through the night, the noise so loud it seemed to shake the earth, though the fields remained empty. The reports reached King Charles himself. The monarch had been present at Edge Hill, had seen his men fall, and he was not quick to scoff at the supernatural. He dispatched a party of officers, survivors of the battlemen who had fought and bled on that very ground to investigate. What they returned with was more chilling than the king could have imagined. They confirmed it all. Not only did they hear the battle, they swore they recognized faces among the ghostly soldiers, comrades, friends, men they had watched die on that field. Imagine seeing your fallen brother still locked in eternal combat, his death replaying in some terrible loop across the night sky. From that moment, Edge Hill's reputation was sealed. Pamphlets circulated across England, spreading the tale of the phantom armies. Some saw it as a divine warning, a sign from God that the Civil War was a sin against the kingdom. Others whispered that the ground itself had been cursed, the sheer violence of that first great clash, leaving an imprint so deep that even time could not erase it. Skeptics have long tried to explain the Edge Hill visions. Perhaps atmospheric conditions created strange echoes of far-off sounds, what modern science calls acoustic shadows. Or maybe it was nothing more than mass hysteria, a community traumatized by the war, retelling stories until they believed them. But the detail is what makes Edge Hill's tale endure. Officers recognizing faces, townspeople hearing weapons they themselves had carried descriptions, matching the battle hour for hour. And so the question lingers, did Edge Hill's dead truly march again? Or was it the mind's way of refusing to forget the horror of civil war? What is certain is this: centuries later, locals still speak of the fields with unease. Some claim that on the battle's anniversary, when the mist rolls down from the hills, you can still hear faint drumming on the wind. Perhaps it is only imagination, or perhaps Edge Hill is proof that death does not always end in silence, that on some battlefields history insists on being heard again and again. Gettysburg, 1863. If Edge Hill was England's first taste of civil war, then Gettysburg was America's most bitter feast. Nearly 2 centuries after phantom armies clashed above the English countryside, another nation, newer but no less divided, would stain its own soil with blood. And just like Edge Hill witnesses, would later swear that the echoes of Gettysburg never died. The summer of 1863 was meant to be Robert E. Lee's bold gamble. His Confederate army, lean and hardened from victories in the South, marched north into Pennsylvania. His goal, bring the war to Union soil, threaten Washington itself, and perhaps break the will of the North. Opposing him was General George Meade's Army of the Potomac, 100,000 strong, determined to stop the advance. On July 1st, the two sides collided by chance in the quiet town of Gettysburg. Over the next 3 days, the hills, orchards, and stone walls of that Pennsylvania countryside became a cauldron of slaughter. 50,000 casualties in 72 hours. Deadliest battle in American history. Imagine the scene, heat rising from the field's cannons thundering with such force that windows shattered miles away, men charging with bayonets into smoke, so thick they could not see their own comrades. On the rocky slopes of Little Round Top, Union, soldiers fought tooth and nail to repel desperate Confederate assaults. The cries of the wounded, some begging for water, some praying to God, echoed across the ridges. By the time the guns fell silent on July 3rd, corpses carpeted the fields. Locals, unprepared for such carnage, dug shallow graves. Torrential rain soon unearthed the bodies, leaving grisly remains exposed for weeks. Gettysburg was not merely a battle, it was a nightmare pressed into the American soul. And like Edge Hill, the horror did not rest quietly. Almost immediately, tales circulated of phantom sounds, musket volleys cracking in the night, bugles blaring across empty fields, cries of soldiers that no living throat could have uttered. Visitors spoke of ghostly apparitions wandering among the gravestones, searching for comrades who never came home. To this day, Gettysburg is regarded as one of the most haunted places in America. But what makes the Gettysburg legend even more compelling is not just dusty folklore, it is modern testimony from ordinary people like you and me. One such account comes from 2015. A woman who we will call Kate shared her experience online under the name Running 94. She and her family visited Gettysburg, excited for the history, unaware they were about to step into something far stranger. On their first night at the hotel, Kate's younger brother suddenly bolted upright in bed. His eyes wide, he rushed to the door and flung it open. When asked what was wrong, he said, "Didn't you hear it? Cannons, men yelling, orders being shouted." But the rest of the family had heard nothing. For Kate, it was unnerving, but it was only the beginning. The next day, Kate climbed Little Round Top, that infamous ridge where Union soldiers once fought for their lives. Lying between the rocks, pretending to aim a rifle as the soldiers once did, she suddenly felt a hand on her shoulder. Then a voice, low, urgent, whispered in her ear, "I see him." She spun around, ready to scold her brother, but he was standing several feet away by a monument. No one else was near. Shaken, Kate tried to brush it off as imagination, but as the days went on, the strangeness deepened. One evening, as she and her mother stood speaking with an elderly couple near the fields, the air filled with the sound of fife and drum music, the very songs Civil War soldiers played on the march. Yet the fields were empty, no reenactors in sight. The older couple, pale and unsettled, excused themselves quickly and drove away. Kate and her mother remained listening to the spectral tune fading with the sunset. On their final day, Kate and her mother hiked up Big Round Top, adjacent to Little Round Top. Exhausted, they sat to rest on a boulder. That was when the world went unnaturally silent. No birds, no crickets, no rustle of leaves. Then suddenly the air exploded with chaos. Horses snorted and charged past. Bugles screamed, muskets fired, men shouted orders, and then came the most chilling of all voices crying out in agony, "Help! Help me! I don't want to die!" The sounds lasted only minutes, but for Kate and her mother, it felt like an eternity. They fled back to the parking lot where a ranger noticed their pale faces. His calm reply only added to their unease. "You wouldn't believe how often I see that look. You're not the first. This is what makes Gettysburg so powerful as a ghost story. It is not just the weight of numbers, though 50,000 casualties would leave scars anywhere. It is not just the gruesome aftermath of shallow graves and decomposing bodies. It is the persistence of these accounts repeated by visitors across decades, across generations, often by those with no interest in the paranormal. Skeptics, of course, point to explanations. Perhaps acoustic shadows carried sounds from far-away reenactments. Perhaps stress suggestion and imagination combined to create illusions. But just as at Edge Hill, the detail is hard to dismiss. A whisper in the ear, a bugle where no player stands, voices crying words no tourist guide would invent. For believers, Gettysburg is proof of the stone tape theory that trauma so intense it bends the air, can be etched into the very rocks, the very soil, and played back like a broken record. For others, it is something darker, stranger perhaps, a folding of time where past and present overlap for a few fleeting moments, allowing us to glimpse the chaos of July 1863. What cannot be denied is the enduring power of Gettysburg. For Americans, it is hallowed ground, a symbol of sacrifice. For paranormal enthusiasts, it is a hotspot of restless souls. For visitors like Kate, it is both history refusing to stay silent, tragedy refusing to be buried. So the question remains, when you stand on those ridges, listening to the wind, are you hearing echoes of memory or the living voices of the dead? Dieppe, Eid, 1942 FAP. By the 20th century, warfare had changed beyond recognition. Machine guns, tanks, bombers, and artillery now defined the battlefield. And yet, despite all the steel and technology, one truth remained unchanged. War still left its scars, not only on people, but on the very places where it unfolded. One of the most tragic examples came on the French coast in a town called Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, Allied commanders launched a daring experiment. The plan code-named Operation Jubilee was to test German defenses with a lightning raid across the English Channel. It would be the first major action for Canadian troops in World War II, supported by British commandos and a small contingent of American Rangers. Over 6,000 men in total, backed by 237 ships, set out in the pre-dawn darkness. But the operation unraveled almost immediately. German patrol boats detected the flotilla offshore, and by dawn the defenders were ready. As the Canadian troops disembarked, they stumbled straight into a kill zone. Machine gun nests on the cliffs poured fire into the exposed soldiers. Mortars and artillery rained down. Tanks bogged in the loose gravel of Blue Beach were easy targets. In just a few hours, the raid collapsed into catastrophe. The cost was devastating. Of the 5,000 Canadians who landed, nearly 1,000 were killed, more than 200 to 400 wounded, and another 2,000 captured. For a country of only 11 million people at the time, it was a national trauma. Dieppe would forever be remembered as Canada's blood-soaked baptism of fire. Yet, just like Edge Hill and Gettysburg, the story of Dieppe did not end with the burial of the dead. 9 years later, in the summer of 1951, two Englishwomen, Dorothy and her sister-in-law Agnes, were staying at a seaside hotel in Dieppe, enjoying what had become a tranquil tourist destination. The war was over, the beaches were full of sunbathers and swimmers, and the horror of 1942 seemed distant. But in the early hours of August 4th, Dorothy awoke to a sound that should not have been there. At first it was faint, like distant thunder rolling across the sea. Then came sharper cracks, rifle-fire machine guns, the unmistakable pounding of artillery. Dorothy rushed to the balcony and Agnes soon joined her. What they heard was not a storm, it was a battle. For the next 3 hours, the two women sat frozen, listening as the night replayed the nightmare of August 1942. They heard the roar of low-flying aircraft, the explosions of bombs, the rattle of gunfire echoing from the cliffs. They heard men shouting orders in English and German alike. And most haunting of all, they heard cries, agonized, desperate cries, cut short by bursts of machine gun fire. By dawn, the sounds faded with the morning light. The beach below was empty, peaceful as if nothing had happened. But Dorothy and Agnes knew what they had heard. Later, when researchers from the Society for Psychical Research documented their account, they found something chilling. The sequence of noises the women described, the timing of the artillery, the delay of the landing craft, the clash at Blue Beach matched almost exactly the historical timeline of the Dieppe raid. It was as if the two women had listened to the battle in real time, replayed 9 years later by the very ground where it had happened. For skeptics, this was coincidence layered on imagination. Perhaps the women heard echoes of military exercises or mistook natural sounds for combat. But for believers, it was undeniable evidence of what paranormal scholars call stone tape theory, the idea that traumatic human events can imprint themselves onto the physical environment, stone, soil, even sea, and play back like a recording. Dieppe, then, is not only a battlefield of history, it is in some tellings a haunted stage where the dead continue to fight their doomed assault on an endless loop. Today, tourists stroll the beaches without fear, unaware of what lies beneath the sand. Children build sandcastles where Canadian soldiers once fell. Cafes serve wine where artillery once thundered. And yet stories persist. Locals whisper that on quiet summer nights, if you listen carefully, the surf carries more than waves, it carries the echoes of war. Perhaps Dorothy and Agnes were mistaken. Or, perhaps, like the shepherds of Edge Hill and the visitors of Gettysburg, they stumbled into that strange liminal space where past and present collapse, where history does not rest, but insists on being heard. Standing at Edge Hill, Gettysburg, or Dieppe, one question inevitably rises. What exactly are people hearing? Are these truly voices of the dead, locked forever in a cycle of battle, or are they simply the tricks of physics and psychology? The debate is as old as the stories themselves. Acoustic shadows, science's answer. The most conventional explanation comes from acoustics. Sound, after all, is notoriously fickle. It bends, reflects, and distorts depending on terrain, temperature, and wind. Military historians know this well. During the Battle of Gettysburg, 150 Confederate cannons roared in the largest bombardment of the Civil War. Citizens in Pittsburgh, 150 miles away, reported hearing the thunder. Yet, bizarrely, farmers a mere 10 miles from the battlefield heard nothing at all. The explanation: acoustic shadows. This phenomenon occurs when sound waves encounter barriers like hills or valleys, or when atmospheric layers refract them in strange ways. Some areas become silent pockets, while others act like amplifiers, carrying the noise for impossible distances. To skeptics, this is enough to explain ghost battles. Perhaps visitors to Gettysburg or Dieppe were hearing distant gunfire reenactments, or even military drills distorted and carried in unexpected ways. The human brain, primed by history and suggestion, filled in the blanks, transforming vague rumbles into cannons, faint music into fife and drum whispers, into cries of the dying. It is a neat explanation, logical, measurable, and grounded in physics. Yet it feels incomplete, because acoustic shadows explain how sound travels, but they do not explain why witnesses sometimes describe sequences matching historical battles minute by minute, or why soldiers' voices are heard speaking words of terror rather than anonymous noises. Stone tape theory, memory in matter. This is where the paranormal steps in. In the 19th century, Charles Babbage, the mathematician who laid the groundwork for modern computing, proposed the idea of place memory, that the environment itself could record and replay human actions. Later, psychical researchers expanded this into what became known as stone tape theory. The idea is deceptively simple: stone, soil, or other natural materials act like a tape recorder. When an event of extreme emotional or traumatic intensity occurs, especially involving violent death, the energy imprints itself into the environment. Under certain conditions, that recording replays ghostly sounds, apparitions, even full scenes. It is not that souls remain trapped, but rather that the battlefield itself remembers. To believers, this explains Edge Hill's phantom armies, Gettysburg's ghostly bugles, and Dieppe's replayed gunfire. Trauma on such a massive scale does not vanish. It sinks into the earth. Centuries later, an unsuspecting passerby may trigger the playback. The experience is not interaction with spirits, but with the memory of the place itself. Stone tape theory has an eerie elegance. It treats hauntings not as religious or mystical, but as quasi-scientific imprints, recordings, echoes. Yet critics argue it lacks empirical proof. No instrument has measured such imprints. No experiment has reproduced them in controlled conditions. It remains a metaphor, not a science. Psychology, culture, and the human mind. There is also the human factor. Wars, especially civil wars, leave psychic wounds. Communities scarred by loss may unconsciously keep stories alive, passing them from generation to generation until they manifest as perceived experiences. In this view, the hauntings are not acoustic tricks or geological tape recorders, but rather the collective memory of trauma expressed through folklore. When Kate at Gettysburg heard a whisper, it was not the battlefield speaking, but her own imagination shaped by everything she had read, heard, or expected. And yet, if it is only imagination, why do accounts emerge from people with no prior knowledge? Why do details align so precisely with historical fact that tension between skepticism and belief is what makes these stories endure? A third possibility, time itself. Some theorists push further, suggesting that neither physics nor folklore fully explains the phenomenon. Instead, they speak of time slips, moments when the boundary between past and present thins. Perhaps on certain nights, under certain atmospheric or magnetic conditions, people do not hear echoes or memories at all. They hear the actual battle as it unfolds in another time, bleeding briefly into hours. Just as a cassette tape can hold multiple recordings layered over one another, perhaps reality itself layers events. War, with its sheer intensity, burns its track deepest, and sometimes the needle of human perception skips backward. why it endures. In the end, no single explanation satisfies everyone. Acoustic shadows, stone tape, psychology, time slips, each solves part of the puzzle but leaves gaps. What is undeniable is the persistence of the stories. From 17th century pamphlets to 21st century online forums, people continue to report the same experiences. Different nations, different wars, different landscapes, but the same unsettling refrain. The dead are not silent. And maybe that is the point. Perhaps the enduring hauntings of battlefields are less about ghosts and more about reminders. War is not easily forgotten. The ground remembers the people, remember, and sometimes in ways science cannot yet explain. The past insists on breaking through. Wars end, treaties are signed, and monuments are built. But as we've seen tonight on some battlefields, the story never truly finishes. At Edge Hill, shepherds swore they saw armies clash in the sky. At Gettysburg, a modern traveler heard soldiers cry out, "Help me, I don't want to die." At Dieppe, 2 women listened in terror as 3 hours of battle replayed from the sea. Whether you believe these are acoustic tricks, geological recordings, or true hauntings, one truth is undeniable: places of great suffering resist silence. The ground remembers what the history books can only summarize. And maybe, just maybe, the reason these echoes endure is to remind us of the cost of war, not in numbers, but in screams, in whispers, in the shadows of those who never came home. So I leave you with a question: if you stood alone on these fields and the air around you split with the thunder of battle, would you dismiss it as imagination? Or would you accept that history was speaking directly to you? Tell me what you believe in the comments, science, spirits, or something stranger still. And if you want to hear more haunted echoes of history, join me next time as we travel to Okinawa, where the ghosts of World War II still walk the island. Until then, listen closely. Sometimes the past is louder than we think.